Great question. I think most important is knowing your boss's character. I think being able to somehow examine his character, her character, is really critical. And the way I suggest doing that for a student coming in and interviewing, typically, you get the opportunity to interview with your boss, in a situation where you're making a decision on. And if you're not, that's a problem. So I'd recommend, number one, make sure they get a chance to interview him. And interviewing him, ask him about the ethical climate in the company. You walk in, you see values posted on the wall. Say, boss, I see those values. How does the company kind of roll those out, and how does that actually live out day to day? And let him answer that question. Then second, ask him, how does he live that out? What does that mean to him? What does integrity mean to him? How does he live that day to day? How does he do it when things aren't going well? How does he do it when things are going well? And does that differ? How does that play out? And then I think asking him about his boss, the same question, is probably a good idea. And why do I say all that? I think I've seen enough derailments in my career because of this disconnect of character between an employee and their boss. It's usually what causes somebody to leave a company. In many cases, they're just not satisfied that there's an alignment of the values that person's living out versus what you want to live out as an employee. So, and then second, I would suggest trying to get an understanding early on of what the controls, processes, routines are, that the standard process that should be followed, the way things should be done, so that you can contrast that as an employee with the way things are being done. And I think the best thing to do there is, on an ongoing basis, find people that are well respected, who have wisdom, appear to have strong character, and ask them some questions about how they handle disconnects between what the procedures say and what's really happening in the business. And use some live examples. Buy lunch for somebody who's been there 20 years and survived, and say, how do you do this? How do you see these kind of transactions? How do you see this happening? How do you see this behavior from a leader that we observe? You and I were in a meeting last week. How do we see that person, behaving? And does the company care? Does the company really care? And if there's an issue, how do you speak up? How do you get that to the surface? The thing I wouldn't do is listen to people say, that's the way it's always been done. Because that gets people in lots of trouble. There's people in my career, I've seen people sit and watch and later regret the fact that they didn't speak up. And because they're, in many cases, potentially held accountable for standing by and watching and not doing anything. The other thing I would suggest is shining a light on, putting processes in place that will shine a light on potential transactions gone bad. An example of that is, making sure, let's say there's a payment process that's allowing inappropriate payments to go through. Find out a way to generate an exception report that highlights those and get those to people further up in the chain of command, and get those in front of people and begin to just say, I'm looking at these transactions. I see some things that don't seem to sync up with our procedures. Does that make sense? And confront them in a nice way, in a winsome way. It doesn't have to be hostile, doesn't have to be accusatory, just do it in a winsome way. And the last thing I would suggest here is being ready with the newspaper test. When you're in a meeting and things are going the wrong direction, and there's 9 people in the room that you can see aren't comfortable, and there's one person driving the thing in the wrong direction, being ready and willing to say, hey guys, time out. If we just stop and reflect on what this might read like in the newspaper tomorrow morning, and what our neighbors and friends and our grandmother and our mother and our father, what are they going to say about this? Are you all going to be proud of this being published? Now granted, might not be, but if it was, would you be proud? That's, I think, the question. I've seen with that single question, again, not asked in an accusatory way, just a Lieutenant Columbo kind of, hey man, don't think I'm understanding this. It's turned the direction of meetings and attitudes more than any single question I've ever asked in my career. Now, step back from that. That's kind of what I think is important for people to know going into an organization. I also think it's important they observe the environment. And I'm going to use something that some folks out there may not be familiar with, but I'm going to just use it as an example because I think it's a good way to challenge things, and that's the fraud triangle. There's really three things that it takes to allow something to go wrong. And one is pressure, another is opportunity, and the third is rationalization. And if you go into an organization and you see an environment where people are being asked to do unreasonable things and hit unreasonable targets, that creates pressure and causes them to behave differently, and they don't have the opportunity to push back. That's the first factor. Second factor is, are there controls in place or not in place that are weak enough that allow something to go wrong, that allow, if somebody's under pressure, to do something inappropriate? And then third, do you hear rationalization for some of the things you question? Do you hear people saying, hey, that's the way it's always been done. Hey, it's only a small amount of money. Hey, it's not near as important as our bonuses are. Those kind of answers, those kind of three factors combined, I think if young people going into new jobs and new organizations would watch and just see, what are those three factors? Pressure, opportunity, rationalization. Do they exist or don't they? I think it tells you a lot about potentially what you might be getting into. Yeah, it's critical, especially at an early stage in your career when you're learning. I tell young people that go into jobs, and both including my children and other people I advise, just be a sponge. You first go into an organization, learn as much as you can. And it doesn't mean staying in your cubicle all day and learning your desk. It means getting out into the factory, getting out into the service center, wherever you are, and talking to people in the various functions, particularly those people that your work touches, and understanding, okay, I take this and I fill this out and I sign it and I approve it and I check it and I hand it to so-and-so. What does so-and-so do with it? Follow that thing all the way through a process. Builds relationships, and then ask questions just about, well, why do you do that? And does that really would that prevent somebody from doing such and such? And just be a bit inquisitive. Again, not being accusatory, but just being inquisitive and trying to learn. I think back to the competence thing, it's building that foundation of learning that ultimately is going to give you more influence in the organization. If people see that you're out in the functions, learning outside of that, get out of your box, I guess is probably the right colloquialism here. And just make sure you're learning how your job affects the total organization. And then you can begin to question some of the ethics, right? But without that learning, you're really not in a position of competency to even ask the question.